This meeting is being recorded. So just so you know, we're trying to keep in-audience conversation to a minimum because this will pick up your chat, and we're going to have subtitles turned on, and I don't think you want that necessarily preserved in our formal transcript that will be available for streaming online. Do I need to speak up? Because this is, okay, so when Mike does his presentation, we will try to project as best possible. And is this good? If at any point anyone can't hear any of us, just sort of like give us a frenetic gesture in the back and we'll pick up our vocals. But all right, so before we begin our formal presentation, I'm just going to give the folks that are online sort of a quick tutorial so you can take like a 30-second rest right now here in the audience. And for those of you online, we have like, I want to say at least 20 plus people in this room. So it's exciting to sort of give this experimental hybrid public meeting a try. But so for those of you that are online, we want to make sure that we have a smooth meeting tonight. So we're going to give you a quick how-to for this WebEx platform. On the left side of your screen, closed captions have been enabled. So to use them, you're going to click on that little CC button. I'm going to get my slides to advance here. Give you a little. There we go. All right. So you're going to click that little CC button to turn closed captions on. If you're on your phone attending tonight, you're going to click those three little dots and then click Advanced and select closed captions. All attendee videos for the public are turned off this evening. That's just so we can avoid any distractions for those online and in our recording. You might also have noticed that we have automatically muted everyone online. But don't worry, during public comment, we are going to be able to unmute you so you can ask questions or provide comment. To be called on at that time, you can click the little raised hand icon and our staff member will unmute you to speak. Again, if you're on your phone, you're going to click those three little dots, click raise hand to be unmuted. And you can also at any point during the evening send us a chat message to request to speak at the end of the meeting. If at any time you need to leave the meeting, you're going to click that big red X icon. And a reminder again that this meeting is being recorded, and so you can watch at your leisure here in a couple of weeks if you want to revisit it or if you didn't have an opportunity to watch live tonight. Again, staff are going to be monitoring our chat box, and with that, I'm going to turn it over now to Elaine Chinian, who's going to welcome you to tonight's presentation.
Well, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Paige. My name is Elaine Chinian, and I serve as the Regional Director, covering the operation of 10 historic sites and 10 state parks in the Saratoga Capital District region of the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. I really regret not being able to join you tonight as I've been under the weather for a couple of days, but I am delighted to be here remotely. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. As we make plans for our properties, public participation is essential and welcomed. We look forward to your feedback and ideas. Tonight, we're taking a close look at the site of the Ulysses Grant Cottage atop Mount McGregor. This plan seeks to balance development of public access and amenities with respectful preservation of the site. The plan you'll see tonight incorporates the expertise of our State Historic Preservation Office, our Environmental Stewardship and Planning Bureau, regional and park operations, as well as considerable input from the Friends of Grant Cottage, our programming partner on the site. To place this site in context, please note that this historic site is part of over 6,000 acres protected along the Hudson River waterfront and up on the Palmertown Ridge and everywhere in between for Moreau Lake State Park. OPRHP is a proud partner with Saratoga Plan, the Open Space Institute, the Department of Environmental Conservation, and others to preserve the Palmertown Range, an area specifically identified for protection and recreation in the New York State Open Space Plan. We are also a partner in the Sarah B. Folk Friendship Trail Initiative to offer a multi-use trail system inclusive of all abilities. All this is happening around the Grant Cottage site atop the mountain. We're working closely with our sister state agencies, Empire State Development, DEC, Corrections, Office of General Services, and the Department of Transportation to make the former prison property ready for redevelopment, a plan which will likely include an additional transfer of acreage around the prison and Cottage to OPRHP for parkland stewardship. In addition to this planning effort for the Cottage, we are also wrapping up this spring the installation of a truly state-of-the-art fire suppression system to guard against threats to the Cottage and its remarkable collection of furniture and artifacts. And as well, more historic site projects are planned for this year to repair the visitor center roof and to repair and repaint portions of the Cottage itself. I have many people to thank tonight and to introduce. First, I want to thank our dedicated and generous partner organization, the Friends of Grant Cottage, along with Parks and Trails New York, for laying the groundwork for this plan. I believe that perhaps President Tim Welch and Executive Director Beth Merrill may be in attendance. I wish I could see you all, as well as other board members. Thank you all. I'd like to welcome and thank Heather Mabey, Chairwoman of the Regional State Parks Commission. Paige Barnum, who started this off. She is lead agency planner for this project. Greg Smith is head of our Bureau of Historic Sites. Kurt Kress is on the line. He's leader of our Regional Capital Program. Daniel McKay is on the line. He's Deputy Commissioner for Historic Preservation. He's joining us remotely tonight. We appreciate that. As well as we've got Brian Strasovich, our Regional Operations Manager. And I think we've got a whole pile of other people too. You can tell that the agency is pretty excited about this, and many people contributed, and we thank them all. I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce two key new staff members in this effort. Lisa Polay. She is our Historic Sites Regional Supervisor, just joining us from stints as the manager of both Crown Point and Johnson Hall. And I'd like to also welcome Kevin Dinan, who is the Moreau Lake State Park Manager. And finally, very special thanks to Mike Panich, Dave Miller, and the team at the LA Group for their superb leadership of this project. You've been practical, pragmatic in approach, and we welcome all the work that's gone into this process and this product very much. So thank you guys. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Paige and the team.
Computer here. Turn on closed captions. Okay, now we're off to the races. Well, I'm Mike Panich with the LA Group. As Elaine mentioned, I'm project manager for this strategic development plan, as well as the previous 2021 strategic development plan that we completed a couple of years ago with the Friends. I'm here to present the public information meeting today. We've got a lot of ground to cover. We kind of have to make the assumption that some of the people in the audience tonight might not have any familiarity with the site at all. And so we're starting from the very beginning, and I'm going to walk you through the whole process of what is a strategic development plan. We're going to talk about the existing site conditions, overview of the Grant Cottage State Historic Site and National Historic Landmark. We're going to then talk about the proposed improvements of essentially the meat and potatoes of the strategic development concept plan. And then after all of that is said and done, we'll open it up to public comment. So to dive right into the question of what is a strategic development plan, essentially what it accomplishes is it maps out all of the existing and historic elements of the site. It summarizes all of the key stakeholders' future goals and development objectives for the site. And then it collects and presents all that information, all the images, the plans, the visual simulations, descriptions of all the proposed site elements and improvements. It collects and presents all of that for easy consumption for the public. And after all that is said and done, it then provides phasing recommendations, cost analysis, and project implementation strategies so that it can essentially act as a roadmap for beginning to end for it to become a reality. Why we created it, essentially our goal was to help OPRHP and the Friends of Grant Cottage to better support the mission and goals of the historic site while also better meeting all the needs and interests of the visitors and the visitorship, which grows continually every year. In 2021, we completed a strategic development plan, kind of the first level of it that was led by the Friends group, and it established kind of their preferred concept plan recommendations for the future site improvements, and it helped achieve their longstanding goal of successfully transferring the former correctional facilities recreation parcel to OPRHP ownership so that it can become part of the usable site of Grant Cottage. And then now that we're here in 2023, we're updating the strategic development plan so that it can be formally adopted by New York State Parks so that once it's adopted, we can then go into the funding and implementation of all the proposed improvements. And so this little graphic here just kind of showcases the site where this kind of small orange blip here is the actual cottage parcel, which is a small, little less than half-acre sized parcel. And then the larger magenta parcel is kind of the surrounding landscape that's been part of the ownership of the site since 2015. And then this blue parcel here represents the recreation parcel that was the new addition that came into Parks ownership last year. So the steps for us to be able to have OPRHP adopt the updated strategic development plan. First, we produced a supplemental planning methodology report, which documented all the planning and analysis processes that underlied the 2021's recommendations. Then we updated the concept plan to reflect any new findings and to help facilitate Parks' mission to provide a safe and enjoyable recreational and interpretive opportunities for visitors while still being responsible stewards of the valuable natural, historic, and cultural resources of the site. Today, we're hosting the public information meeting, which is for any interested agency, organization, the general public, individuals. It's all open to everybody to comment on the updated plan. And following the completion of this kind of public outreach effort, then we'll be updating and finalizing the strategic development plan to ensure that the document incorporates the interests and concerns of the public, the agencies, stakeholders. Essentially, we'll distill everybody's comments and try to squeeze as much as we can into the plan so that it reflects everybody's desires for the future of the site. I'm going to walk you through kind of an overview of the history of the site, and as well as kind of an overview of the existing conditions that are currently on the site, and kind of highlight some of the needs that we found during our analytical investigations. Before I get into the kind of nitty-gritty of what's happening on site, I want to walk you through a timeline of the site. Beginning in the mid-19th century, a man named Duncan McGregor purchased the mountain. In 1872, he began building on the mountain, and the mountain was named after him by the local ministers. The cottage that is presently the Grant's Cottage was built originally on where the recreation parcel is today. In 1882, the mountain was sold to a group of investors, and a railroad from Saratoga and farther south was built towards the top of the mountain. In 1883, the cottage was moved from its then current location in the recreation parcel to its now current location, and that was in order to make room for a larger hotel, which was then built where the current recreation parcel sits today. And in 1884, that hotel, the Hotel Balmoral, was built and opened. The hotel boasted up to 200 guests and featured electricity. There's a small image of it here on the bottom of the slide. Also pictures of the train station platform at the adjacent to the cottage, as well as kind of the trestles that led the train up the mountain to the cottage site. In 1885, several things happened. First, most importantly, perhaps, June 16th, Grant moved into the cottage. His stay was short, but during his stay, he completed his much lauded book, the personal memoirs of U.S. Grant with the help of his family and close friend Mark Twain. Went on to win a lot of awards and is a very important cultural piece of our history. Unfortunately, a little over a month later, on July 23rd, he passed away. On August 4th, a memorial service was held on Mount McGregor, and it was said that trains up to the mountain were filled to capacity in order to bring the mourners to the service. In 1890, Mount McGregor Memorial Association was established, and that was to take care of the cottage after Grant's death, and it opened shortly after as a historic site with a live-in caretaker. Some bad news: in 1897, Hotel Balmoral burned down and was not rebuilt. In 1910, the majority of the property was sold to the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, and a tuberculosis sanatorium was built and opened shortly thereafter. In 1945, the sanitarium was converted to a veterans rest camp. There's some images of the old sanitarium from the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company here on this slide. In 1960, New York State took over the Veterans Camp facility and converted it into the Mount McGregor division of the Rome State School, which later became the Wilton State School. In 1976, the Department of Corrections assumed control of the site and converted it into a minimum security prison, which later then added some medium security facilities. In 1985, New York State announced plans to permanently close the cottage at the end of the season, but facing community pressure, the state reversed its decision and the site remained open, much to the joy of all of us. In 1989, the Friends of the Ulysses S. Grant Cottage was formed to operate and take care of the cottage, and it's alive and well today. 2014, the prison permanently closed, and 2015, on October 15th, OPRHP acquired about 707 acres of land that was adjacent to the cottage's original parcel through a transfer of jurisdiction from the Department of Corrections. 52 acres, roughly 53 acres of that allotment was assigned to Grant Cottage, with the balance assigned to Moreau Lake State Park. The map image here kind of showcases those transitions where the current corrections ownership here is in the cyan color. The small orange, yellow, or actually yellow square is the original Grant Cottage parcel, the 0.44 acres. The larger orange around it is the 2015 transfer of jurisdiction. That's the 53 acres of land. All of the larger green areas surrounding that is the land, the remaining balance that went to Moreau Lake State Park. And then this magenta color here towards the middle is the newly transferred land, the recreation parcel, which measures to be 4.21 acres. So in 2021, the Friends, as I mentioned, they led the strategic development plan, and it was published, and the recommendations included site-wide improvements, many of which were contingent on the transference of that recreation parcel. And luckily in 2022, the requests were answered, and on March 22nd, OPRHP acquired that recreation parcel through a transfer from Department of Corrections. And here we are today in 2023, where we are updating the strategic development plan. And once this is formally adopted, implementation of the recommendations can begin. So to give you a little bit of context where we're at geographically, if you see here on the, will be your right, the Palmertown Conservation Area is kind of, Elaine alluded to it earlier, it's kind of the wider recreation network that's become formed that kind of stretches from Moreau down to Saratoga. Moreau Lake State Park takes up quite a bit of it here, centrally located, with Grant Cottage located towards the south of that. And then there's various trail networks and stuff that will ultimately wind down all the way to Saratoga Springs. Zooming into the center of that map, you have here another view of those main elements of the Grant Cottage parcel, the recreation parcel, and the 52-acre parcel adjacent to the cottage. Zooming in further, we have the site itself. Kind of key project areas that want to highlight here are the cottage itself here, centrally located. Here you can see that 0.44 acre small boundary of the original parcel of land. Moving beyond that is the 52 acre parcel, which includes the visitor center, parking for both Grant Cottage and the visitor center, the Eastern Overlook Trail Network here towards the east. Just to let you know, the maps from here on out have switched their orientation, and now north is to the right of the map, east is to the bottom, west is to the top, south is to the left. Here at the north end of the Eastern Overlook Trail Network is a train shed, kind of a remnant site where the train shed used to be, where at the end of the day, after the train came up the mountain for its last run, they would keep it overnight here on top of the mountain at the shed location here. The recreation parcel of 4 acres of land stand here, and I'm going to switch to the next slide because that will show some of the locations of these historic elements that no longer exist on the site. One of them being the railroad line that kind of came in through the center of the Eastern Overlook Trail Network. The train shed, or sorry, the train platform, kind of the train station for the site, kind of was across the street from the current day location of the visitor center. The Eastern Overlook is still there today. It was formerly housed a gazebo. Now it has the Grant's Last View monument, as well as a flagpole and a viewer. Moving up here, I mentioned earlier the engine shed, and then there was a staircase that led up to the Belmore Hotel, which rested here on the recreation parcel prior to burning down at the end of the 19th century. So some of the considerations that we had for the original and the updated strategic development report was how to balance sustainability, the existing cultural resources of the site, the historic landscape, with more modern needs for visitors, recreation, expanded trails, safer trails, expanded programming for visitors and for the cottage staff. Accessibility is a big topic, especially given the difficulties of the rugged terrain of the mountain. We're on top of the mountain, but there's still a lot of mountainside to kind of navigate, especially through the trail network, connections between the visitor center and the cottage, which sit at different ends of the site. And there's a vast amount of difference in elevation change between the two. How can we establish accessible routes from one to the other and increase that pedestrian circulation throughout the site in a safe way? And also included with circulation, not just pedestrians, but also vehicular circulation. How do we balance vehicles with pedestrians and try to maximize the safety of any interactions between the two? To dive into some of the key areas and some considerations that we have, looking first at the visitor center here at the bottom of the site. Upon arrival, as you're moving up the entry drive from the bottom of the mountain, you first hit the visitor center. The existing building and arrival experience improvement recommendations that we had included replacement of the existing porch, improved entry plaza space, safer space. It's a very tight turn of the road that goes in front of the visitor center. There's not a lot of space from anybody exiting the visitor center and cars coming down the mountain. So we're looking for ways to kind of increase the safety of that kind of situation. There's a need for sanitary system upgrades, the deep desire for expansion of the parking facility at the visitor center. And as I mentioned, safety, vehicular traffic calming, and patron safety, road crossing improvements are all kind of primary focuses for that visitor center area. Here we have images of the northeast corner of the visitor center. You can see how tight it is between the edge of the road and the edge of the building. And then here at the across the roadway, we have the parking facility, which has, I believe, 7 paved parking spaces, and you can see how quickly those can fill up any given day of the year. Moving up the slope to Grant Cottage itself, building access improvements are a big topic here. I mentioned accessibility improvements. You know, the cottage is accessed through the porch, which sits up above the adjacent land. Right now, there's a ramp that connects to a single accessible parking space here on the north end. Here on the map, it's located right here. We're looking for ways to improve that access to make it more amenable to kind of the historic landscape while also improving the general accessibility. We're looking at ways to realign the road and parking relocation so that we can restore that cultural landscape to the building and its arrival areas. But we're also looking for ways to expand the parking to meet the needs of the cottage and the adjacent property. The recreation parcel. This is a great element that can provide new programming, parking expansion, new infrastructure expansion. The parcel, we're looking to redevelop it so that it can include an event pavilion that would serve for greatly expanded programming needs for the cottage and for the Friends. And we're looking for expanded satellite parking that would alleviate the parking limitations elsewhere on site. And we're just looking at general circulation, utilities, stormwater management upgrades as needed. Here we have a couple images. This is looking located about here in the center of the parcel, looking towards the north, about to where the Balmoral Hotel would have sat and where the event pavilion would now sit, kind of at this northeastern edge of the ledge of the mountain. And here's a view looking across the entirety of the parcel. You can see how expansive the land is here. It's once again, it's 4.2 acres of land, which would provide plenty of opportunity for expanded parking down here in the lower edge of the property. And then up here would be mainly open space and the event pavilion and any circulation improvements. Trail and overlook area, the Eastern Overlook Network Trail. Mainly we're focused here on accessibility improvements and how can we expand the interpretation that's on site. The south and north ends of the trail here, the south being on the left, north being on the right. And we're looking to expand the accessibility, make better improvements, and then ultimately remove the center trail spur, which has kind of been deemed to be unsafe due to its kind of steep descent. The Eastern Overlook destination here, we're looking to improve, provide more amenities, provide a grander experience of that overlook, which you can see the entirety of the east all the way to Vermont and beyond, and down south to Albany on a clear day. And it's a really breathtaking view. We're looking for how we can really capture that and interpret it. And then elsewhere, the train shed remnant site here on the northern end. We're looking at ways that we can incorporate new destination interpretation node there, and perhaps even include some sort of interpretive trail that would follow the old rail bed through the woods. Another big thing I wanted to mention was the connectivity between the visitor center and the Grant Cottage. Right now, there's not a lot of pedestrian connectivity between the two. It relies mainly on walking up the steep ascent of the roadway on the roadside itself. In general, pedestrians sharing the road with cars is never an ideal situation. So we're looking for ways to pull the pedestrians off the road, be it a roadside sidewalk or a more accessible route that would wind up through the landscape in order to attain truly like a wheelchair accessible route from one to the other. Lastly, the picnic grounds towards the middle of the site. Existing is a kind of very bucolic, very peaceful area amidst the mature pine trees, and you have a few picnic tables spread out. We're looking for ways to enhance that, as well as to include a more accessible pedestrian connection to bring people to the picnic grounds. Also, there's a beautiful overlook potential here at the northern end of the site. Here you can see this is without any clearing at all, just on a beautiful fall day. You can see that potential view to the north, how beautiful it can be. If there was a little bit more selective clearing, it would really open up the site and frame those views to the north towards Lake George. Parking limitations is a big thing that we looked at on site. The existing total on-site parking of paved parking stalls is 13 total stalls, 7 being down at the visitor center, 6 being up at the Grant Cottage, which includes 1 dedicated accessible reserved space. Mainly right now, the cottage relies on roadside and lawn parking and formal use of these adjacent areas to have overflow parking throughout the season. It also depends on informal use of the existing correctional facility parking lot here to the west of the property, as well as expanded parking area or pull-off areas that exist further downhill on the entry drive. And there's also currently no dedicated bus parking or loading zones. So we're now going to jump into some of the proposed improvements. As a general overview of the site, kind of to highlight main areas of consideration, we're going to be looking at visitor center improvements, trail improvements, which are going to be phased into 2 different areas, both the south and the north end, pedestrian connectivity improvements between the visitor center and the cottage, cottage improvements and parking improvements, road realignment, and then recreation parcel improvements, which would include a satellite parking facility and event pavilion, and then the picnic ground improvements, which would include the picnic overlook and general picnic ground improvements. To briefly touch on the parking expansion between the existing and the proposed plans for the 2023 updated strategic development plan, the expanded visitor center facility would include 11 total parking stalls, which would have 9 standard spaces, 2 accessible reserved, and 1 access aisle. This kind of vehicular traffic circle that brings the vehicular traffic throughout the site would include 10 total parking stalls. 6 would be standard stalls on the north end and 2 accessible reserved, as well as 2 accessible reserved on the cottage side of the circle. Each of these pockets of accessible reserved spaces would have their own dedicated access aisle as well. And then the satellite parking facility here at the northwest end of the property would have 49 total parking stalls, 47 of which would be standard spaces, and then 2 accessible reserved and with 1 access aisle. So total parking comparison between existing conditions and proposed conditions, and this is strictly with the paved parking stalls, would be a 57 space net gain of on-site parking, bringing the 13 existing up to 70. Focusing on the visitor center end of the site, the visitor center entry improvements. As I mentioned, we're looking to replace the porch as well as to build out a new entry plaza, which would have a gathering node, bike racks or bike repair station, bench seating, gateway signage. It would kind of funnel people to the visitor center in a more strategic fashion. The expanded parking facility for the visitor center would include those 11 spaces I mentioned. It'd also have a walkway and orientation signage. There'd be installation of a new speed table that would cover the entirety of the parking facility. So as cars drive up the entry drive, they would pop up onto the speed table, causing them to slow down through the entirety of the kind of frontage of the visitor center before popping back down and continuing their way up the mountain slope. And so that would provide patron safety crossing improvements between the facility and the visitor center. Speaking to pedestrian connections between the visitor center and the Grant Cottage, I mentioned wanting to have a dedicated pedestrian sidewalk along the roadside, which would be included here on the western side of the road so that people could exit the visitor center, not have to cross the road again if they didn't have to, and make their way up to the cottage. Also, as an option for a truly accessible route, there'd be an accessible route that would come through the woodlands and up the backside of the cottage to the north side of the porch. And as I mentioned, this is all on a mountainside, so it is very difficult to achieve an accessible route, but it is possible given enough linear distance to make up that distance of height gain between the 2 elevations. Along that pedestrian connectivity route, we are proposing the installation of the new caretaker memorial garden, which currently there's a small plaque down here in front of the cottage, which would get relocated to this new location along that pedestrian route, and it would serve as a nice backdrop for kind of the views to the south. Moving to the trail network, I mentioned they kind of come in two different phases. The first trail improvements would be to realign the southern end of the trail, which would allow for a wheelchair accessible route from the visitor center front door down to the eastern overlook. The eastern overlook itself would have a new interpretive destination node installed, which would include a paved plaza space with seating, a wall overlook barrier that would have a low profile interpretive signage mounted to it, as well as mounted binoculars. The existing Grant View, Last View Memorial would remain in place as it is today, as well as the existing flagpole. Mentioned that the removal and restoration of the central trail segment will be part of this improvement. For the second phase of trail improvements, we will be taking a look at the northern end of things. This side of the trail network was much more rugged. We looked at options for trying to attain a wheelchair accessible route, and it just wasn't in the cards without completely going out of bounds with too much tree clearing and stuff. And so in order to minimize the footprint of disturbance, we thought it best to provide regraded safety improvements, new step systems along the trail route, but to have it still be a stepped trail system on the northern end. That way, you still have a lot of safety improvements, but it would have a minimal disturbance footprint, and the character of the existing woodlands would remain intact. I mentioned the train shed remnant site would feature a new interpretive destination node, and the trail, interpretive trail that would follow the old train route, the trail bed that exists through the woodlands would be created, which would help to bring more accessibility towards the northern end of the site. Moving on to the cottage improvements and the new satellite parking facility. I mentioned we're realigning the road, creating this traffic circle for traffic calming, and it would also allow for expanded parking along the northern end, which would be utilized both for the cottage as well as for the future event pavilion. On the southern end, on the Grant Cottage side of things, we would have expanded accessible parking reserved spaces compared to the current allotment for the cottage, and there'd be new accessible routes to the cottage's deck or porch, as well as we would take offline the existing drive that goes directly in front of the cottage. We would kind of carve away half of it and turn that into just a dedicated pedestrian route. So that would increase the green space in front of the cottage, and it would still maintain kind of that historic carriage route that was in front of the cottage, but now it would be strictly for safe pedestrian use, and allow for expanded lawn in front of the cottage. The entry drive winds up, existing entry drive winds up and goes towards the correctional facility. We would utilize that existing roadway to gain access to the new satellite parking facility. I mentioned that would have 49 stalls, 47 dedicated standard spaces, 2 accessible spaces, and 1 access aisle. And that leads to the event pavilion, which would be a new event building, event space that would have restrooms, storage. There'd be solar panels for electricity. It would have a new well for it, as well as its own dedicated wastewater treatment system. There'd be dedicated open space and festival grounds around the event pavilion. There'd have to be a new sanitary leach field to serve it down here, kind of towards the picnic ground area. And then for the picnic ground improvements, we would have the improved picnic areas, new routes for pedestrians to circulate through the grounds, There'd be a staircase that would be installed that would gain access directly to the northern end of the Eastern Overlook Trail network, as well as lead to the picnic overlook deck with the walkway that would lead onward towards the traffic circle. During the 2021 strategic development plan, the JMZ architects partnered with us for some ideas on what that event pavilion could look like. We worked hand in hand with the Friends to kind of establish what they needed, how they wanted to kind of function for them. Ultimately, they decided on open air kind of pavilion. We wanted it to pull in some of the features of the historic train platform, which you can see kind of here on the frontage of it, kind of recreated here at the front of the event pavilion. I mentioned there'd be restrooms and storage included on the pavilion. On the back end towards the northern side, there'd be the overlook deck. This is different from the picnic ground overlook deck, which would be down to the side here. This would be dedicated to the pavilion itself. This view here kind of gives a kind of an idea of that entry walk to the pavilion. This is a view from inside the pavilion, kind of looking outward. And one more image of the kind of anticipated view of that kind of northern overlook deck from the pavilion side of things. Moving towards implementation and phasing, we recommend that we kind of seek implementation into 3 basic phases. This image shows those phases set against the existing conditions plan. The first phase would include improvements to the southern end of the Eastern Overlook Trail, improvements to that central corridor of the site, which includes the visitor center, the parking area and traffic circulation of the cottage, and then the satellite parking facility. The second phase would fill in the gaps between the cottage and the visitor center. So you'd have those pedestrian connectivity improvements, as well as the event pavilion itself and all of its sorted circulation improvements and infrastructure improvements. The third phase would fill out the remainder of the site, which would include the picnic ground improvements, as well as the last phase of the trail improvements. So to quickly walk through how that would appear as we're implementing it set against the existing conditions. Everything that's grayed out is the existing conditions. And so this is the first phase where you can see the improvements of the trail network's south end up to the overlook. That would be the improved destination node. And it would have the visitor center improvements, including the expanded visitor center parking lot, and some of the roadside improvements, the gateway improvements to the visitor center, the plaza, the porch replacement, and the cottage improvements, which would include the new traffic circle, the expanded parking on both sides of it, the road realignment in general, all of the front improvements to the Grant Cottage area, so the accessible route onto the porch, the changes to the pedestrian routing in front of the cottage, and the pedestrian connections out to the northern end of the traffic circle, as well as towards the new satellite parking facility. And so this phase would include that installation of that satellite parking facility and any sort of necessary stormwater management involved in it. Phase 2 would include those pedestrian connectivity improvements, including the caretaker memorial garden and the accessible route from the visitor center up to the cottage, as well as the new event pavilion, any of the circulation between the satellite parking facility and the traffic circle, as well as any of the infrastructure needed for the pavilion, which would include wastewater disposal and new well pump. Phase 3, again, would be the picnic ground improvements, staircase connection between the picnic grounds and the northern end of the trail network, as well as the picnic grounds overlook deck, And then the trail improvements would be those safety improvements and new staircases to the northern segment of the trail, the installation of the interpretive train route trail, and the interpretive destination node here at the train shed remnant site. So altogether, those three phases again, first one focusing on the southern end of the trails and the main spine of the site. Lots of parking infrastructure improvements. Phase 2 would be the event pavilion and pedestrian connectivity. Phase 3 would be the rest of the trail improvements and the picnic ground improvements. So with all of that said, I think we are going to move on to the public comment period. Any questions? I know that was a lot of information thrown at you very quickly, rapid fire, but we can speak to any of the plans. I can pull them up on the screen here if you have questions. We are here to listen. Paige, do you want to lead the to and fro?
Mike mentioned, we're at public comment, which I'm sure you are all excited about. And also, I know you can't see them, but we have a wealth of experts on the line. So our State Historic Preservation Office is online, our regional director is online, our Bureau of Historic Sites director is here. And so what we're going to ask is if you have a question or comment and you are here in the room, to make sure we get you on the recording, we're going to ask that you come up to the front. And if that poses any sort of challenges for you, I'm happy to repeat what you say back here. I don't want to make this, a cumbersome or inconvenient process for anyone. We also ask that you limit your comments to no more than 2 minutes, just to make sure that everyone that wishes to speak has an opportunity to do so. I'm not going to set like a timer and at 120 seconds cut you off. Don't worry, you'll have time to wrap it up. But so with that, if anyone would like to ask a question, pose a comment, come on up. We welcome you to do that. And with that, I will open it up to you all. Yes, sir. Yeah, absolutely. And we also ask that you introduce yourself, and if you're affiliated with any organization, add that information in your introduction.
My name's Steve Betts. I'm affiliated with Grant Cottage. They might not admit that, but it's true. Okay, no jokes. 2 questions. You didn't mention funding for the project, and you didn't mention a time frame. Do you have that?
Thank you for the questions. So time frame would be a quicker answer here. Essentially, the 3 phases, it can push and pull in either direction, but the hope would be that phase 1 would start implementation in the 1 to 3 year period, and then phase 2 would follow behind that. So that would be the 4 to 8 to 10 year period. And then phase 3 at the tail end would be the 10 to 15 year period. To speak to funding, essentially everything we need to have this process be completed and to have the strategic development plan formally adopted by OPRHP prior to being able to implement any of these ideas. And so as part of the final strategic development plan, we're going to be including cost estimates and to establish general budgets for different projects and stuff. But essentially, once it's completed and formally adopted by Parks, at that point, funding can be sought, whether it be directly through Parks or through grants or through fundraising. It's going to be probably have a combination of those sorts of strategies in order to gain the funds for any particular project. With that in mind, those 3 phases may push and pull depending on how funding ends up shaking out. There is a possibility that funds would be more plentiful than what was in the original strategic development plan for phase 1. And so you might be able to increase the project scope and bring in some of those phase 2 elements as part of that first phase. On the flip side, if funding wasn't as big, then you might have to cut some of the scope out of that first phase of implementation. It just depends on kind of how that shakes out. I believe the Friends are currently applying for a grant for implementation of that first phase of the trail improvements, so that southern end of the trail. And so, correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, but yeah, so they're actively applying for funding to begin implementation of that first trail improvement segment, which would create an accessible route from the visitor center down to the eastern overlook. So, things are already beginning to happen. It's really going to start to gain momentum once parks can formally adopt the updated strategic development plan. You're welcome.
It's Mike, right?
Yes.
Mike, you've done a masterful job here. By the way, my name's Tim Welch. I'm president of the Friends Group that operates Grant Cottage. This is Mike Lesser, who is the treasurer. And you've done a masterful job over the years of coming up with a very comprehensive plan. I just want to let you know that we think it's wonderful and a tremendous amount of effort has gone into it. And in addition to that, the 4.2 acres of land that used to be part of the Mount McGregor Correctional Facility has come into our possession, so to speak. And that allows us to increase parking and expand the site and talk about a pavilion. However, Mike and I wanted to talk specifically, do you have that slide? Can you bring up the slide where we show the visitor center up close and the proposed parking scheme?
Bear with me one moment. We'll get zoomed in here for you.
Yeah. So that's a good. Now, this is primary concern that we have because the reality of Grant Cottage is most people come up to this visitor center and we take them through it and we give them an idea of what they're about ready to see. And it's sort of we set the stage for the great man came up there in 1885 and we give them a little history of U.S. Grant and we give them a history of the mountain. And it's an important part of the tour. And the payoff, of course, is going to the cottage itself, where Grant spent a good deal of his time. But the visitor center allows us to talk about the general as general and as the president for 2 terms. So we spend a good deal of time talking to people here. And the parking circumstance has always been a challenge. And this parking regime only adds 1 spot to what we have at the moment. And as a result of that, we feel that we're spending a tremendous amount of money and not getting a lot for it in terms of the parking. And had people come up there and investigated, people from the town of Wilton, people adjacent to where we are located. And they believe that we can add some fill in here and expand the parking perhaps another row. And we wonder if you have taken that into consideration, Mike. And if that is a potential part of the future plan.
It could
Or
certainly.
is this chiseled in granite?
No, nothing is chiseled in granite. Everything is open to additional investigation. One of the key things of these preliminary concept plans was that most of the background information that we had to go on is based on data gained from the GIS sources, which have a level of detail that is not comparable to an actual survey. So once implementation for any particular project occurs, there'd be a site-wide survey that would be able to give a full idea of exactly what you have to work with. Included in that sort of investigation would be geotechnical borings and stuff that would give a better idea of the soils out there, whether you could build, extend the fill, as you mentioned, or whether that would be more cost prohibitive. That's all going to end up having to be a balance between the real world variables of cost and what you gain out of it.
A couple of people from the highway departments of the town of Monroe and Wilton came up there and investigated, and they thought that they could bring up enough fill to create another row of parking. And we say that that's really good for us because we bring people up there and then they take a look at the cottage and, well, Mike, I don't mean to cut you out of this. Why is the visitor center parking so important to us?
Well, that's our main concern. Before I comment, just let me thank Parks, the LA group, Parks and Trails New York for funding the master plan that put together first. So, we really appreciate all that. For the most part, we're very supportive of all of the items in the plan. The only concern we really have is parking. The way the traffic pattern works now is people come to the visitor center. We're limited to just about 10 people on a tour at a time, which means 5 or 6 cars that come. So people come here to the visitor center, they park. When they're ready to take the tour, they generally drive up the mountain. We don't want them to leave their cars by the visitor center because of the limited parking there. And then they'll be coming back down afterwards to visit the museum and visit the shop at the visitor center. So right now, there's just barely enough parking to accommodate the visitors whenever we're busy. When we're busy, the parking spaces completely fill up. So the way the plan is set right now, it doesn't really increase the number of spaces that we have here over by the visitor center. The other concern we have is the number of spaces and the way the spaces are aligned up by the cottage. We have a relatively elderly demographic of people going to the cottage. Not everybody requires a handicap space, but the distance that people have to walk is certainly of concern. The way the parking is set, can you go to the cottage?
Certainly.
Question.
Sure.
Can you make sure that you stand at the lectern online
Oh.
is having a hard time.
Okay.
So,
Okay, so the way it's set up right now with the traffic circle, the people will park, except for the 2 handicap spaces adjacent to the cottage, people would park on the far side of the traffic circle, and that would be a 415-foot walk over somewhat of a slope to get back to the cottage, and that could be somewhat difficult for the demographics that we have of the people at the cottage. Certainly, the overall parking with 57 spaces, I mean, we appreciate that, and that will certainly help us at the visitor center when we have events at the pavilion. But for the normal business that we have of people visiting the cottage, the parking is just inadequate. People will be parking, will continue to have to park on the grass, and the people will have somewhat of a long walk to the cottage unless they qualify for one of the 2 handicap spaces over by the cottage. The other concern that we have going into the future is if the site is ever open to trails going into Moreau Lake. I know that part of the Saratoga plan was to open up trails. So there's issues there with both the security of the cottage, which certainly we've expressed in the past, but also the adequacy of the parking. If people park there to use trailheads, that's going to be a concern. So that's, I think, further in the future, but it's something that really needs to be considered when we're looking at this overall at the overall site plan. The comments that we've had, we've summarized in a letter from the Board of Trustees, which we've submitted in writing to Parks. So you have the gist of our comments plus the more detailed comments, along with comments relating to the existing traffic pattern that we have. So that's basically the only concern that we have is the way the parking will work for the cottage. And as I said, while it's great to have an accessible trail from the cottage, from the visitor center up to the cottage, we don't really want people leaving their cars at the visitor center because there's just isn't enough spaces there by the visitor center.
It's a choke point.
Yeah,
for
people
our
leave their
visitors.
cars there, people are going to come up and there won't be any place for anybody to park. So that's basically the gist of our comments.
That being said, you've done a marvelous job of designing a very historic place where a lot of people didn't think that they would be able to access this. And of course, the other thing is a long-term issue, and that is what's going to happen to the road leading up there? But that's not your problem. That's ours. But ultimately, we're very concerned that that road is becoming dangerous.
Mount McGregor Road.
The Mount McGregor
Well,
Road.
there's two parts of the road. There's the public part of the road going up to the gate, which there are people who live on that road, and then the remainder of the road up into our gate, it's starting to get very, very potholed. It's not clear who actually owns it and whose responsibility it is at the moment. So that's an issue that's outside of this plan that needs to be addressed. But there's also issues concerning the integrity of the road going from the gate up to the cottage. And that's obviously something that would have to be addressed with any organization that wants to take over the correctional facility, because they would need that for access. And it would be their responsibility. And yeah.
And that's not your concern here, but we thought we'd bring it up in front of a bunch of people.
Well, in the interim, before the, while there is no plan for the correctional facility, there are going to need to be repairs made to that road so that the structural integrity stays there and it doesn't become dangerous.
We wouldn't want to spend all this money on a great site up there and not be able to get there. Except by helicopter.
To interject, but we're trying to make sure that we get through all the comments, but our comment period is open through, I believe it's June 7th. And we're happy to talk further.
Very good.
Yes, thank you, gentlemen.
Daniel,
Just to quickly touch on some of the points that you gentlemen bring up. I think that when it becomes time to begin implementation of any of these phases, there's going to be a period where everybody, all the interested parties have to come to the table and kind of push and pull on their different priorities. I know that there is the deep priority and need for expanded parking that has to be weighed against both the cost as well as the historic nature of the cultural landscape of the site. And so it's not going to get answered today. It's not going to get answered as part of the strategic development plan. It's going to get answered as implementation comes to fruition, and that sort of extra layer of investigation and discussion can happen at that time. Everything
Cost of this today.
Everything that is on the map today is not priced currently. It was priced in 2021. It was priced in 2021, but it hasn't been updated yet. That's the last part of this process. And so we wanted to make sure that we had all of the details on the plan before we went through the exercise of updating the costs. That said, when implementation comes, that's when we would revisit the kind of conceptual design here and change it as necessary to make sure that everybody's needs are addressed as best as possible. So is that something that's virtual that I need to press a button?
Daniel, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
And I'll lower my hand. Yes, good evening, everyone. Just a comment. So I serve as Deputy Commissioner for Historic Preservation and oversee the work of the Division for Historic Preservation, in which sits the Bureau of Historic Sites, as well as the staff at New York State Parks that reviews proposed projects for potential archaeological and historic resource impacts. And I just want to note, thank you for the presentation this evening. Thank you already for the active engagement and dialogue. But within this three-phase plan, and within the specific nodes within each phase, the state preservation office, as these projects are identified for design, as they are identified for funding over potentially a 10 to 15-year period, we will need to be doing 1409 or Section 106 review for each component, and I don't want that to escape notice this evening. There will be both historic resource and above ground historic resource and archaeological screening for all of these projects on a case by case, project by project basis, and so there will be there will be extensive review and comment by the State Preservation Office as these plans developed and are implemented. So that's a review that happens for every historic site in the system, every state park in the system, and it meets our requirements under federal and state preservation law. So just a note for the record, there will be additional layers of review for each project component that moves forward.
Thank you, Daniel. Yes. Come on up.
Hi, I'm Beth Merrill, the Executive Director of Grant Cottage. Daniel, back to you 1 second. I just want to make sure I understood what you were saying because I don't know what those numbers mean. So I'm going to take a stab at it. And I believe what you're talking about is historic things like Native American sites or some other kind of historic nature that you might discover that would change the plans in the direction in which we go. Is that correct?
Yes, correct in part. The reviews under state preservation law, which I reference shorthand as section 1409, and the reviews that might be triggered under national preservation law, which I shorthand referenced as section 106, those are all triggered by public monies involved in execution of these projects, public permits, etc. So we will be screening each project for potential archaeological impacts, and we will be screening each component project here for a potential above ground resource impacts. And for example, that might shift the parking a little bit one direction versus another. It might constrain, might direct a pathway in a slightly different direction to avoid or minimize historic resource impacts. It might require certain materials be used on the pavilion construction as opposed to others. So it is that level of review, triggered by our obligations as an agency to federal and state preservation law.
Great. Thank you very much. It's kind of what I thought, but I'm glad you said it instead of me. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, sir. Come up.
I'm Reed Antis. I'm on the Board of Trustees. The first thing I'd like to discuss or to talk about is the visitor center. That is our major revenue stream. And it's either before people have to buy the guided tour tickets. We have items in the facility as well as our preamble video before they go up to the tour. And I don't think you really discussed the pattern of how people are going to go to the visitor center before and after. So the goal is we want them to go there to pay for their guided tour, see what's in there, and plus see our video before it. And then after the visit of the guided tour we want to go back there and also spend money. And I don't think you really show the flow of how people are going to go there first and come back last. That's one comment. And then the next comment on the event pavilion, you never talk about what the capacity is. And I think the future, in my personal opinion, is that's one of the major future of creating more people aware of the cottage because of the use of educational programs that we can create. And it works well with the parking lot up there, but the flow of people going to the cottage and I think is been neglected or not really understand the flow of how people, as this is a tourist site, an educational tour site, and how you're going to get people through there where our revenue stream is as the board that we need to things like that. That's, I think, the key elements there. And it'd really be nice to know what you plan on the capacity.
So to touch first about the kind of circulation patterns, as you mentioned, kind of existing patterns, the arrival upon the site, the visitors first go into the visitor center, they get the lay of the land, they learn about Grant as a person, as a general, as a president. Then they make they're asked to relocate their car adjacent up the slope. And the situation of the full build out of this plan, if this came to fruition and existed today, after they left that visitor center, they would then make their way up. If they were fully capable to do so, they'd be asked to park in the satellite parking facility and then make their way to the cottage itself, or to begin their guided tour, audio tour. At the end of the tour, as I understand it today, as a way to kind of entice visitors to stop back into the visitor center, they're offered a free gift of some sort. And we're not proposing any of that change. It wasn't part of our task to kind of look at that inner operations, but I think it would similarly function the same way, where after everything is completed, their day at the site is completed, they would then hop back in their car, work their way back down, park temporarily to the visitor center and run in. And a lot of that day-to-day movement of park, relocate, I don't think that would necessarily change at the end of the day. To talk about the capacities for the event pavilion, we looked at different options during the 2021 strategic development plan. Smaller scale of a 50-person event, larger up to 300-person event, and in dialogue with the friends and looking at what's on site and what's reasonable and feasible, we honed in on this kind of footprint, which is ideal for an event that would range in like 100 to 150-person capacity, depending on what type of layout you'd want. Obviously, if there's chairs with tables, you'd have a smaller capacity that would be in the 100-person range for a conference that required everybody sitting at a table. If it was more of a lecture like we have tonight, where it's someone standing at a podium speaking to an audience in chairs, it would bump up to the 150 sized people capacity. And that's within the structure underneath the roof line of the structure. Obviously, we've included plans to have expanded lawn on the outskirts of the pavilion itself. And so if there's a larger event, a festival, something like that, reenactments, if you want to get into that sort of programming, you'd have that space to kind of overflow out into the lawn areas beyond the structure itself.
Does the parking match the capacity limit?
The parking would rely on the full satellite parking facility, all the parking infrastructure. If it ended up being that 150 people all decided to come in their one car and not drive together at all, no, it wouldn't. But realistic, it would fit that capacity of several people coming as a party to an event. So 70 parking spaces. Yes.
How long do you expect the car to sit parking lot across from you? That's talking about flow of people going back and forth. How long do you think those 7 located spots are going to be tied up when you have a busy Saturday or Sunday when the weather's nice and you have a nice crowd coming up to visit the cottage?
Well,
Doesn't look like we have enough capacity for anything decent flow.
that question I could only answer with a question to you of when someone first walks into the visitor center, how long is that program when they walk through the doors and you lead them through everything and they experience that? Is that a 15-minute journey? Is it a 20-minute journey? And so there, you could think about signing the spots 30-minute parking or 25-minute parking. So that would allow for entry into the building, a bathroom break, and going through the experience before being asked to relocate, rather than park and remain in that spot the entirety of the day. And that would be something that operationally we would want to decide during the implementation phase in terms of how things are signed. If everything is just unsigned with the exception of the reserved spaces, or if all the spaces have a sign, either they're accessible reserved or they're temporary parking only for those 25 minutes of when you first arrive and you're experiencing it, or when you're leaving and you're walking in, you're getting your free gift, you're deciding on a souvenir, you get your souvenir, then you get back in your car and leave. In either case, that kind of temporary spot, I think, could deserve a sign that would indicate that you're welcome to park here, but please don't stay here the whole day in this space. Any other questions?
That's why these spaces are critical.
Mhm.
Love to have another row. Suggesting that we using either the town of Hilton or row
Mhm.
the towns would help us fill to create another line of parking spaces adjacent to the existing spaces there.
Well, it's certainly an idea worth exploring, but as Daniel mentioned in his comments, like any sort of idea like that, that's more of a grander change to the landscape would require their review first to make sure that it's viable from a cultural heritage perspective, especially given the historic sites that have been there before, whether it's the train platform or the staircase, all those elements. We're not, at this level of investigation, we don't know what's under the surface of the ground, if there's anything left or if there's nothing. So that's something that just needs to get vetted at the next level of implementation.
Visitor center, parking garage, prison, change the oil, vehicles. Made very good use of that.
All right, so we have a question online. Melissa, I think you should be able to unmute yourself and submit your comment. Melissa, if you are speaking, you are on mute. And I might ask Madeline on tech support if you can. There we go. I hear someone. Hello, is that Melissa that's unmuted?
Oh, no.
I can hear you.
You can hear me?
Yep, there you are. Hello.
Oh. I'm Melissa Trombley-Proche. I am a founding executive officer of the Friends. I am a current trustee and the site historian. And I just have a comment on a small part of the project that surprised me. And that was mention of the caretaker plaques being moved from the cement monument. And I just want to observe that's probably a conversation that the board should, the Friends should discuss, because that's not something that we have talked about previously.
Well, in the 2021 strategic development plan, that original site plan did include a larger caretaker memorial garden that was located on the back end of the house, kind of on the southwest corner of the house. That plan also included the relocation of that monument, if it was unclear at that time.
Oh, the entire monument would be moved?
That everything would be moved and relocated.
All right, if the cement marker is moved in its entirety and all three plaques stay together, I think everybody could be on board with that.
Yes, yeah, the intention would be that the entire object be moved in its totality. It wouldn't be taken apart piecemeal or anything like that. But essentially just relocated to a location that would be more conducive to the new site plan.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, ma'am.
If you look at the traffic circle. Now I have to get to the microphone before I run my mouth.
Introduce yourself.
Oh, my name's Maybeth Lesser. And I'm looking at the traffic circle just up from the cottage. There is a green area, and that without infringing on the green area too much, you could put in 6 or 8 dedicated handicap parking spaces. And that would help alleviate the problem of some of the older people who had mobility problems. And that you wouldn't really have to go in and tear out a whole lot of trees. And that people routinely park in that area, or, they have. And that could be done and it would solve a problem that we have. That's it.
Beautiful, thank you. Yeah, so once again, that balance of parking definitely needs to be vetted more thoroughly as things continue to progress towards fruition.
I just want to make one other small comment, not so much about the plan, but just, maybe an appeal to parks. One of the things that we need and would be very helpful and would certainly help with some of these issues is the acquisition of a people mover. Especially something that we could use when we have larger events, to move people around the site, especially on the grades. We use that from time to time at some of our larger events. We've gotten a golf cart up there and it's been very, very helpful. So, if parks can try to figure out some way to get us at least a 6-passenger vehicle, that would be extremely helpful sooner rather than later in terms of being able to move people around the site and eliminate some of the issues that we would have with the limited parking.
Is there another online?
I don't believe we have any other online comments. If there are any other comments in the room, we welcome you to come forward. As the slide suggests, our comment period is still open. So if tonight you go home and you're like, oh, dang it, I wish I would have said something, you can still write us. We are accepting posts by USPS, of course, and via email at our parksplanning.info email address. And so during this comment period, we are going to bring the parks team all back together and we are going to review all of your comments. We are certainly going to visit everything that was discussed tonight and discuss what modifications to the plan might be possible. And also you will, when our online recording of this meeting is available, if you listed your email address on the sign-in sheet, that will be another way you will get an email from that Parks Planning account. So you have established a form of communication with us. So that way we can make sure that we are pointing you to where the video is located. You will hear from us. If you write in a comment, we will reply to you to acknowledge that. Yes, sir. Yeah, absolutely.
Paige, right before you make a comment, sir, for emails, does there need to be any specific subject in the subject line or just any email get funneled?
Grant Cottage, anything that suggests, I'm one of 5 people that is monitoring this inbox. So, and they are all other planners in our agency. So it will definitely get pointed to the right team and shared with everyone in our agency and Mike, obviously, being our project team as well.
Come on up, sir. Sorry about that, but just want to make sure that we had all the bases covered with the comments.
My name is Jeff Hamburg. I'm a tour guide, passionately interested in how people experience this. One of the things I don't think you've addressed is how you experience and visit the cottage. Because if I'm hearing you correctly, it's likely that you'd have to park in the satellite parking or in the circle. It's very important that you see the video first. It sounds like a real game of musical cars or something. If you park, then see the video, and then move your car, because the point that was made earlier about the importance of the site parking down below next to the visitor center is because you want the people to go there at least twice, at the beginning and at the end. And the hard part is, of course, getting up to the cottage. I have a problem doing that myself, but so I want to minimize it. But one of the things that was kind of almost interesting is when you showed somebody having to stop there, go up to the circle, and then come back down and then go back up. Once you're at the cottage, oh gee, you want to see the overlook, so you come back down again. Oh yeah, but now it's time to go, and then your car is way back up there. So the point is that the sequence of experiencing the site is important and shouldn't be more labyrinthian than it needs to be. And so, and it's probably a separate sequence if you're visiting the site
Site versus the cottage.
versus the cottage. And there's different ways to do it. It's important to be able to have some flexibility and some cogency to all of that. So, but,
Similar to how it operates now, there's kind of those two distinct.
well, there's a virtue in that it's relatively small now. It's unless it's really busy, but life is going to get bigger. And that's why there's plans. So that's something that I think needs to be addressed further. That's really why that first parking lot is so critical to us and why another line of parked cars would be so great, because so many people start the journey there. They move their car to an area where they can be closer to the cottage itself. And then if they were going to park some distance away in the new 4.2 acres, that much of which will be dedicated to parking, they would be very far away from the starting point, which is the visitor center, which is also incidentally a profit center for us.
Right.
We want people to start and stop at the visitor center and hopefully be so impressed by what they have seen that they'll buy a memento of their visit.
Sir, did you want to come up?
Yeah. Hey, privilege to come board ship. My name's Billy Iser. Been up here 35 years. I taught all the tennis at the Gideon Putnam. And this is such a great area. Okay. All right. But anyway, yeah, the most important thing is that parking. And I came over because Tim Welch maybe. No, it's just a great thing. And but when you're teaching tennis and racquetball and you're doing different things, you meet a lot of people. The first thing when somebody from out of town comes into Saratoga, I say, hey, while you're here, you got to go up and see Grant's Cottage. I go, what's that? And then you explain. And I'm not a big shot, but I did play tennis with Owen Wilson when he came in because that's what he likes doing. And I said to him, you should go up to Grant's Cottage. And I guess he was up there sitting in the chair. Yes. Yeah. So everybody here likes Grant's Cottage. So you see somebody from the track, tell them to go up to Grant's Cottage. That's it.
My name's Ben Kemp. I'm the operations manager, and I'm going to be going into my 10th year at Grant Cottage. And it was a dream to see the ball field be transferred to parks. I believe it is the future of the site. It's a very mountainous area, as Mike knows, and his team has had a challenge just trying to put this together. And I can't thank everybody involved in this enough for putting in all their input and coming up with a design in a very difficult place. One of the things I was just going to mention in terms of the way that this works, it's hard to see this. People online, people that don't understand the terrain so much, it's actually easier to walk from the auxiliary parking, the one over the slight hill down to the cottage than it is to go from the visitor center walking up to the cottage. It's actually less of a slope overall. So it's kind of hard to see those things unless you're absolutely on the ground. That being said, there are some places that have longer walks to get to the historic site. So I really think the team has done a really good job in trying to meet as many of these as possible. But again, I think that some of these things become a little more apparent when you get on the ground. The only comment I would make, and again, it's it's bigger, it's outside the scope, but the discussion of whether or not the site will need at some point a larger visitor center anyway. We discussed this at one of the final meetings. Now that would obviously alter the entire, somewhat alter the planning and the, those kind of things. So there was a mention casually by Elaine earlier that there may be some more land coming this way. I don't know exactly where that is within the prison property, but again, will there be some acreage that would be sufficient for, expanded visitor center at some time? Obviously, maybe a separate capital project, something like that. I don't know how all that works, but that's just something I wanted to bring up. But I'm thrilled with what's here so far, and thank everybody that's been a part of it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, certainly something along those lines could be considered for a fourth phase after full implementation of the things that we've brought up today. Could be considered down the line.
That does raise a very good point. Obviously, that visitor center, they used to change the oil in the trucks at the prison. And we have spent quite a bit of money to make it into a museum. At some point in time, that's phase 5 of what we might. But they have done a magnificent job of putting together a bird's eye view of the future, and we appreciate your effort very much.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
My name is Bill Underhill. I was a tour guide and trustee over the many years. Has anyone thought about what's going to happen to the prison itself? At some point, there's going to be a tremendous change up there, and how it will affect the cottage and our new recreational areas, because it ain't going to be the same way 15, 20 years from now, that's for sure.
There is a great unknown surrounding what will happen to the former correctional facility. That is a question that is unanswered currently and will probably remain unanswered for quite a little bit of time. But you're right, it is a big question, and it'll certainly have a big impact not only on Grant's Cottage and that surrounding site, but on potentially the entire community of Moreau, Wilton, and Corinth. It's all kind of connected at that nexus. And depending on how that gets redeveloped, that could have a huge impact. But to be able to predict that would require a crystal ball that we simply don't have in our hands today.
Step was taken 2 weeks ago when the razor wire was taken down. 4.2 acres of barbed wire. It's stainless steel and probably valid.
All right, any more questions, comments from folks in the room?
Thank you very much.
What? One more.
Read Antis again. The property that we're talking about is in the town of Moreau. Does the town of Moreau have any voice in the matter?
Correctional facility?
No, not the correctional facility, the cottage and any construction, anything done along that, is the town involved at all? Or is it because it's a state-owned property, they don't have to go to the town at all?
Certainly, I think we would want, once things go to construction, I think you'd want to meet any local codes and stuff along those lines. But in terms of having a seat at the table for what the site gets designed as, I don't believe that they would be included.
Cottage itself is in the town of Moreau. Surrounding land in the town of Wilton. A little bit of it in the town of Corinth.
Right.
It's part of the prison, still part of the former prison.
Oh, I was just gonna ask Elaine if she wanted to comment on that or as we're wrapping up, open the floor to you.
Oh, thanks, Paige. Well, this has been great to hear these comments, and I appreciate all of the interest in site circulation, parking. And I guess I was hoping to hear some additional comments about the other elements of the site, but the Friends had told us that they were very concerned about the parking, and we'll just have to work with them to develop solutions going forward. In terms of the town, we are always partners with the local community. State land is governed by the state, so that's what the process that we're doing right now is part of. It's part of our internal review process for planning. So we would welcome the comments from the town, certainly, and we work closely with the towns. They're part of the whole Palmer Town Range program. So everybody's pretty aware of what each is doing. So we're working in cahoots. The town, I know, very much appreciates this site as a destination and as an important cultural asset for the town. So with that, I think I'm just congratulating you, Paige, and Mike on putting together a beautiful presentation. Thank you. And thanking everybody for coming out tonight.
Thank you for those clarifications too.
Yeah, Elaine, it's Mike Lister again. The reason we didn't add too many comments about the rest of the plan is that we're supportive of it. You know, we've looked it over. For the most part, we think it's great. The plans for the pavilion and some of the other improvements. So, you know, we're very supportive of it. So the only real issue we have is what we've presented.
Maximizing as much as possible.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Mike.
Well, thank you all for joining us this evening. I know it was a fair amount of time out of your evening, and so thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you.
You have
That's